The first time I heard the knock, I thought it was just another delivery man. But then I heard it again. 3 sharp raps, each one followed by a faint metallic tap, like a badge hitting wood. My stomach tightened. Something about that sound didn't belong on my front porch. When I opened the door, 2 men stood there in blue polo shirts, each with a lanyard and a badge that looked like it had been printed off a cheap office printer. Their smiles didn't reach their eyes. Behind them, a white pickup idled, its exhaust curling into the morning air. "Marcus Kellerman?" the taller one asked. I nodded slowly, my hand tightening on the doorframe. "We're with County Zoning Enforcement. You've got multiple violations. We need to talk." That was the moment my life turned upside down. But to understand why 2 fake cops came to my door, you need to know how it all started 6 months earlier, when I thought I had finally found peace. I'd lost my wife, Sarah, to cancer 2 years ago. Grief has a way of hollowing you out, leaving you wandering through life like a ghost. I tried the city for a while, drowning in noise and traffic, but every corner reminded me of her absence. Then came the farmhouse, my grandmother Rose's old stone house in Millbrook County. 3 acres of history, surrounded by oak trees that had stood longer than most men lived. The barn leaned a little, the fences sagged, but to me, it was perfect. It smelled of sawdust and oil, of hay and soil, of everything real and solid. I thought I'd escaped. I thought I'd found a sanctuary where grief could finally loosen its grip. Each morning I'd walk down the gravel driveway, boots crunching, the hum of a pickup engine waiting in the workshop where I rebuilt old trucks. Sarah used to tease me for getting lost in my work, grease smeared across my shirt, but after she was gone, that workshop became therapy. Fixing something broken was the only way I knew how to fix myself. But the world had changed around the farmhouse. What once was farmland had been devoured by developers. They called it Willowbrook Estates. 200 cookie-cutter homes lined up like soldiers, every lawn trimmed within an inch of its life, every mailbox identical, every driveway gleaming with SUVs. My land sat in the middle like an island, rough edges against their perfect grid. I didn't mind. Let them have their manicured paradise. I had my history, my independence, my peace. Or so I thought. It started on a Tuesday. The rumble of a white Escalade echoed up my driveway, breaking the quiet. A woman stepped out, perfume preceding her like a warning. She wore designer sunglasses, workout clothes that had never seen a gym, and carried a clipboard thick with papers. She walked up the porch like she owned it. "Good morning, Mr. Kellerman," she said, her voice sweet but sharp. "I'm Delilah Hutchcraft, president of the Willowbrook Homeowners Association. We need to talk about your property." Her tone wasn't friendly. It was managerial, commanding, as if I were a tenant in her building. She clicked her pen and thrust a notice toward me. "You owe $3,200 in HOA fees, plus penalties. You're also in violation for commercial vehicles, unapproved structures, and non-compliant landscaping." I blinked at her, stunned. "Ma'am, there must be a mistake. This land has been in my family since 1945. I never signed up for your HOA. I held up my deed, the paper practically worn thin from the number of times I'd studied it. She didn't even glance at it. "When the county rezoned this area, all surrounding properties were automatically included," she recited, as though reading from a legal script. "That means you, Mr. Kellerman. And right now, you're out of compliance." She gestured toward my barn, my workshop, my old truck. Unapproved structure, commercial vehicle, overgrowth. I felt my jaw tighten. That barn was built in 1960. The workshop was where my livelihood lived. And that so-called commercial vehicle? It was my lifeline. "With respect, I don't use your pool, your landscaping, your clubhouse. I don't owe you a dime," I said firmly. For a split second, her smile cracked, revealing something meaner underneath, something desperate. But she slipped her sunglasses back on and slid an envelope into my hand. 30 days, Mr. Kellerman. Easy way or hard way." Her Escalade roared down the driveway, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust, envelope heavy in my palm. That night, I spread my grandmother's papers across the kitchen table. Deeds, surveys, tax records, maps yellowed with age. Every one of them confirmed what I knew. My land was mine, not hers, not the HOA's. But as I stared at those documents, I realized something chilling. Delilah wasn't bluffing. She was the kind of woman who'd burn the world down to prove she owned the ashes. 2 days later, the knock came. Metallic taps, the kind that set your teeth on edge. When I opened the door, the two men stood there, their badges glinting in the morning sun. The tall one carried a clipboard, his belly pressing against the fabric of his shirt. The other was skinny, eyes darting, clicking his pen nervously. "County Code Enforcement," the tall one announced. "Multiple violations here. We're going to need access." I studied their badges. They looked official from a distance, but up close they were laughable, plastic, flimsy, like toys. My late wife had worked for the county assessor's office. I'd seen real government IDs. These weren't even close. "What department did you say you're with?" I asked. The skinny one avoided eye contact. "Environmental and Zoning Enforcement," he muttered. My gut twisted. That department didn't exist. They handed me citations, professional looking on the surface, but something about the fonts, the signatures, screamed fake. Unpermitted structure. Commercial vehicle in residential zone. Noise violations. I kept my face calm, though my blood was boiling. "I'll be contacting the county office to confirm," I said flatly. They exchanged nervous glances. Within minutes, their truck peeled out of my driveway, tires spitting gravel. As soon as they were gone, I called the county clerk. "Hi, I just received citations from your environmental and zoning enforcement officers," I explained. There was silence on the other end. "Sir," the clerk said slowly, "we don't have an environmental and zoning enforcement department. Who exactly came to your house?" My hand gripped the phone tighter. Delilah hadn't just sent neighbors with nasty letters. She'd escalated to impersonating government officials. That wasn't HOA politics. That was a felony. 30 minutes later, I was at the sheriff's department, photos of the fake badges and their license plate numbers spread out across the desk. Deputy Martinez leaned back in his chair, brows furrowed as he typed into his computer. "Well, that's interesting," he muttered. "Trucks registered to Willowbrook Property Management, LLC. I clenched my fists. "Same address as the HOA office?" He nodded. "Bingo. Mr. Kellerman, this isn't just neighbor drama anymore. This is serious. People desperate enough to impersonate officers don't usually stop there. I'd recommend security cameras. Document everything." I drove home with his warning echoing in my head. That night, as I installed cameras on my driveway, porch, workshop, and back gate, I realized my quiet life was gone. I wasn't just fixing engines anymore. I was preparing for war. The next morning, my phone buzzed with notifications from the neighborhood app. Emergency HOA meeting. Urgent community safety concerns. The posts dripped with accusations. Dangerous property owner threatens community values. Illegal auto shop activity. Lies spread faster than wildfire. By evening, Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor, appeared at my door with a plate of cookies and a worried look. "Marcus, honey," she whispered, "that woman's telling everyone you're planning to turn this into a junkyard." Some folks believe her. I thanked her, but inside, I felt the ground shifting. Delilah wasn't content with harassment. She was orchestrating a campaign to ruin me. She had power, money, and connections. But what she didn't know was that I had something stronger. Truth, evidence, and the stubbornness of a man who had already lost everything once and wasn't about to lose again. The smear campaign didn't stop with rumors. Within a week, strange things began happening around my property. One morning, I walked outside to find my mailbox torn out of the ground. Its post splintered like it had been hit with a sledgehammer. A note was taped to the ruins, typed in block letters. "Violation removed. HOA will replace." My blood boiled. The mailbox had been there since my grandmother's day, engraved with our family name. It wasn't just wood and metal. It was heritage. I called the post office to report the vandalism. The supervisor didn't mince words. "Sir, tampering with or removing a mailbox is a federal offense. File a complaint and reinstall your mailbox wherever you want it. That afternoon, I drove to Home Depot and bought the biggest, heaviest mailbox I could find. Solid cast iron, engraved with Kellerman 1945. If they wanted a war over mail, they picked the wrong man. But Delilah wasn't finished. A few nights later, I woke to the hiss of air escaping. All 4 tires on my truck had been slashed clean through. Spray paint dripped across the lenses of my new cameras. Someone had tried to blind them. What they didn't know was that I'd hidden 2 backup cameras. One in the oak tree, another behind the barn. At 2:47 a.m., those cameras captured clear footage. Delilah herself, directing 2 men in hoodies, slashing my tires. I uploaded the footage to my laptop, my hands shaking. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was organized vandalism, intimidation designed to break me. I sent the evidence straight to Deputy Martinez. He called me back within an hour. "Marcus, this is bigger than you know. We've had 6 other cases like this, always connected to HOA disputes. You're dealing with organized fraud." His words settled in my gut like cold lead. Still, I wasn't about to back down. I doubled my camera system, saved everything to the cloud, and began a paper trail of every incident. My grandmother used to say, "Buy truth, even if it costs you." So I bought it, one piece of evidence at a time. But fate had bigger plans. When I hired a professional surveyor to double-check my property lines, I expected nothing more than confirmation. Instead, I got a bombshell. Around noon, the lead surveyor waved me over, pointing to his GPS equipment. "Mr. Kellerman, your property extends 30 feet further south than these old maps show." Technology back then wasn't as precise. "Half of that HOA office building? It's sitting on your land." The words hit me like a hammer. I stared at the line on the survey map, then at the gleaming brick building where Delilah held her meetings. Half of it. On my property. Suddenly, everything clicked. The desperation, the threats, the lies. Delilah wasn't just trying to control me. She was covering up the fact that her empire sat on stolen ground. That night, I sat in my workshop, fluorescent lights buzzing, maps and surveys spread across the workbench where I usually rebuilt engines. My heart pounded as I compared county records with the new measurements. It was undeniable. My land, my taxes, their building. I wasn't just fighting harassment anymore. I had the power to bring the whole thing crashing down. But fighting one woman's arrogance was one thing. Fighting an entire system of fraud was another. I knew I couldn't do it alone. And that's when unexpected allies began to appear. The first was Jake Morrison, the HOA treasurer. He called me late one evening, his voice trembling. "Marcus, we need to meet. Not about taking sides, just, I've seen things. Numbers that don't add up." We met at a diner off Highway 9, away from curious eyes. Jake slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were bank statements, invoices, payment records. 50 grand for landscaping that never happened. 30 for legal consultations that never went to court. Payments to shell companies tied to Delilah's family. He rubbed his face, exhausted. "She's been stealing from everyone, Marcus. Not just you." I flipped through the papers, each line confirming what I already suspected. Systematic fraud. "Why show me this?" I asked. Jake looked at me with haunted eyes. "Because I have kids here. I moved to Willowbrook to escape corruption, not to feed it. And because that office she built, it's on your land. That means every contract, every meeting, every decision might be invalid. You don't just have a case. You have the power to shut it all down." Next came Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor. She arrived at my porch with a box of old photographs and deeds. "Honey," she said, setting them on my table. "I remember when your grandmother planted tomatoes where that office stands now. This was Kellerman land long before Willowbrook existed." Her trembling hands laid out black and white photos of the farmhouse, the gardens, the barn. All taken decades before Delilah was even in town. Then came Sarah Polson, a local reporter with a nose for corruption. She'd been tracking HOA scandals across the state, but my story was different. "This isn't just abuse of power," she told me. her eyes lighting up as she flipped through Jake's bank records. This is organized crime hiding under the name of community management. If you're willing to go public, this could blow the whole thing wide open. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. We formed a quiet alliance, gathering evidence, building a case. Jake provided financial documents. Mrs. Patterson provided history. Sarah prepared a story that would hit harder than any lawsuit. And my attorney, David Blackwood, mapped out the legal strategy like a general preparing for battle. We'll file a quiet title action, he explained. It forces anyone claiming your property to prove their right in court. If Delilah can't produce legal documents, and she won't, her whole operation collapses. Every night, my workshop turned into a war room. Maps, deeds, receipts, and photographs covered every surface. The smell of motor oil mixed with printer ink as we pieced together the puzzle. The more we dug, the uglier it became. Fake vendors, insurance fraud, intimidation campaigns. Delilah had built her empire on lies, propped up by fear. But fear only works until the truth shines through. Of course, Delilah didn't sit still while we built our case. She doubled down. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, branding me a dangerous criminal, claiming I planned to turn my land into a salvage yard. Utility companies showed up, claiming I hadn't paid bills that were already cleared. And then came the most desperate move of all, an attempted bribe. I found her standing in my living room one afternoon, the window forced open. My pulse spiked. "We need to talk," she said, holding out a check already filled out for $50,000. "This covers your survey, your trouble, everything. All you have to do is drop the legal action and sign this non-disclosure agreement." Her hands trembled, her perfume mixing with nervous sweat. I stared at her, rage boiling under my skin. "You're bribing me to hide fraud." She forced a smile. "I'm offering a generous settlement between neighbors." I pulled out my phone, recording. "So you're admitting the office is on my land?" Her mask slipped. "The building situation can be adjusted if necessary. But this offer won't last. Take the money, Marcus. Walk away while you still can." I didn't take the money. Instead, I handed the recording to David and Detective Williams. With attempted bribery added to her list of crimes, Delilah was cornered. But desperate people fight hardest when they know they're losing. And she still had one last card to play. The HOA called an emergency meeting. The agenda: dissolving the entire association before the investigation could reach its peak. If there was no HOA, Delilah thought, there would be no crime. But she underestimated us. The night of the meeting, I walked into the community center with a folder thicker than any notice she'd ever served me. The room was packed, neighbors buzzing, reporters filming, the air heavy with anticipation. Delilah sat at the front, her smile stretched thin. And that's where the real showdown began. The community center buzzed with tension. Rows of folding chairs scraped against the tile floor as neighbors shuffled in, whispering to each other in urgent tones. Cameras from the local news crew flashed in the corner, the red recording light glowing like a watchful eye. I walked to the front row, folder under my arm, heart thumping like a drum. Every seat was filled, every face turned toward the head table where Delilah sat, flanked by her board members. She wore her usual designer armor. Pearls, silk blouse, hair sprayed into submission, but her hands trembled slightly as she shuffled her papers. "Order, everyone, please," she said, her voice sweet but strained. "Tonight's emergency session concerns matters of great importance to our community. There have been misunderstandings, rumors, and certain individuals stirring trouble. We're here to clear the air." Her eyes locked on me for the briefest moment, daggers hidden behind a smile. She motioned for silence, then launched into her speech about unity, community values, and preserving property standards. Her words dripped with practiced charm, but I could see it in the crowd, the doubt, the weariness. People who once trusted her were starting to see the cracks. When she finally opened the floor, I stood. The room hushed. My pulse roared in my ears. "My name is Marcus Kellerman," I said firmly, holding up my folder. "My family has lived on this land since 1945. For months, I've been harassed, lied about, and threatened by this HOA. Tonight, I'm here to show you the truth. I spread the survey maps across the projector table, the new GPS readings glowing on the screen. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Half of the HOA office sits on my land, I said. This building was built without permit or consent, which means every meeting you've held, every decision you've enforced, was done under false authority. Delilah's face paled. That's not true. Those maps are doctored. But her voice cracked under the weight of her own denial. I pulled out the bank statements Jake had given me. Here are payments for landscaping that never happened. Legal consultations that never existed. Shell companies traced to Delilah's relatives. She hasn't been protecting your community. She's been stealing from it. The room erupted, shouts, murmurs, neighbors flipping through photocopies I handed out row by row. Delilah slammed her hand on the table. This is slander, she snapped. But before she could continue, I pressed play on my phone. Her own voice filled the room. Take the money, Marcus. Walk away while you still can. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the outrage. Neighbors stood, shouting questions. You bribed him. Where's our money, Delilah? You lied to all of us? Even her board members shifted in their seats, eyes downcast. Shame and fear etched across their faces. And then came the final blow. Detective Williams, who had been standing quietly at the back, stepped forward with 2 deputies. Mrs. Hutchcraft, you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, harassment, and impersonation of government officials. The room froze as the deputies cuffed her hands. The pearls around her neck glistened under the fluorescent lights. A queen stripped of her throne. Delilah thrashed, shouting protests. This is a mistake. I did it for the community. You'll regret this. But her words fell flat. No one came to her defense. The very people she had controlled now turned their backs, whispering angrily, eyes full of betrayal. As they dragged her out, the cameras captured every second. By morning, her face would be on every news channel. The story of a corrupt HOA president brought down not by lawyers or politicians, but by the stubbornness of one man who refused to be bullied. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Neighbors arguing, board members resigning on the spot, some even apologizing to me. I stood quietly, exhaustion settling into my bones. This wasn't triumph. Not yet. It was the beginning of something bigger. In the weeks that followed, the county investigation spread like wildfire. Auditors pored over records, discovering years of fraud and tax evasion. Money had been siphoned not just from our neighborhood, but from several others where Delilah's relatives ran similar schemes. Arrests followed, board members, shell company owners, even contractors who'd cashed fake checks. The empire she had built crumbled overnight. The HOA was dissolved by court order. Residents were reimbursed, liens lifted, illegal fines refunded. Many of them approached me afterward, shame heavy in their voices. We're sorry, Marcus. We believed her lies. Thank you for standing up when we didn't. I accepted their apologies, though part of me still carried the sting of their silence during those long months of harassment. The county awarded me compensation for the illegal use of my land. Enough to restore the farmhouse, repair the barn, and finally fix up Sarah's garden the way she'd always wanted. But more than money, I gained something deeper, freedom. No more notices, no more fake cops, no more threats. Just quiet mornings and the sound of engines humming in my workshop. One evening, as the sun set behind the oaks, I stood at the edge of my property. The HOA office building, once a symbol of Delilah's control, had been torn down. In its place was an open field where children played soccer, their laughter carrying through the twilight. The neighborhood, once divided, was healing. Without fear, without manipulation, people began talking again. Sharing meals, lending tools, helping one another. Mrs. Patterson joined me, her cane sinking softly into the grass. Your grandmother would be proud, she said, her voice warm with pride. I swallowed the lump in my throat, staring at the horizon. I hope so. She always said this land was about more than soil. It was about family, about standing your ground when the world tries to push you out. 6 months later, the farmhouse stood stronger than ever. Fresh paint gleamed on the shutters, the barn's roof no longer sagged, and the garden bloomed with roses Sarah had once planted. I sat on the porch with a glass of sweet tea, watching the neighborhood kids kick a ball where Delilah's empire once stood. For the first time in years, I felt peace. Not the fragile peace that can be stolen, but the kind you earn by fighting for what's right. I realized something then. Losing Sarah had nearly broken me, but standing up to Delilah, refusing to bow to fear, had reminded me of who I was. Not just a widower clinging to the past, but a man who could carry a legacy forward. My grandmother's grit, my wife's laughter, my own determination, all woven into the land beneath my feet. The fight had been ugly, the nights had been long, but in the end truth had won. And sometimes that's all you can ask for.